So we're going to talk today about two different kinds of stories. One, a kind of dominant story that I've noticed in the early literature of COVID-19 that talks about community from the perspective of species, from the perspective of enormous populations, that we're all going through the same kind of experience together during the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the second half of class, we're going to be looking at some populations whose stories were omitted or overlooked within this dominant story of the lockdown. The title of today's class, Whose COVID Story? Race, Class, and Precarity. So here's the general structure what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to begin with a brief introduction to US COVID statistics. We're going to begin with 2022 at the absolute present and move backwards in time to June 9th, 2020. We'll have a discussion of the University of Chicago professor Rosanna Warren's poem Naturally, which I'm going to take as embodying a certain dominant tendency in the poetry of early COVID-19 that does cast the world as going through the same kind of collective experience, before having a really brief discussion of Emily Steinberg's Ring the Bells and some of the limitations of that perspective, before pivoting roughly at the halfway point in the class to a brief introduction to the early racial history of COVID-19 within the United States. We'll then have a look at Zadie Smith's Postscript to her essay collection that was published in August of 2020 called Intimations. We'll also be setting up a discussion of Tommy Orange's The Team, which we won't get to, I don't think, this week, but we're going to be setting that up for the start of next week's final seminar. And then finally, we're going to conclude class. So what you see in front of you is the COVID tracker from Johns Hopkins University that you may have been looking at a time or two over the last 2 years of this pandemic. This is taken from last week, and I think it's important to note that pretty much exactly 1 week ago today marked a pretty devastating milestone in the United States history of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see at the bottom there, a week ago, the United States crossed the threshold of over 1 million COVID-related deaths and 83 million infections. On Thursday, May 12th of this year, President Biden ordered the flags across the country to be placed at half-mast for the entirety of that period leading up to the recording of the millionth death. And a bunch of newspapers in the United States have been trying to grapple with these just incredible numbers. Some of the stories they've told to kind of put that 1 million into perspective. 1 million is more Americans killed by COVID-19 than died over the last 4 decades of the HIV pandemic. This is about 300,000, a little over 300,000 more deaths within the United States than died from the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. It's also approaching or at the same number of Americans who were killed in all wars in American history from 1775 to the present. 1 million is a larger number than the population of 5 of our 50 states. It's also larger than the population of Washington, D.C. And it's led to a number of calls from newspapers and on social media to try to figure out ways of honoring or marking or memorializing this terrible occasion. And we'll talk next week at the end of class about how the future of COVID memorialization might work. But this is a huge collective experience that the United States is going through, continuing to go through, and that the globe is continuing to go through. And so it makes sense that in some respects, the story of COVID-19 is the story of all of us. We've all been affected in profound ways and in minor ways, in myriad ways, by this incredible pandemic. But I want to take you back because the story that I want to tell, the story of this series of public seminars, is the early literature of COVID-19. I want to look at how Americans understood the first wave of COVID. So I want to take you back to June 9th of 2020. For those of you who are interested, I got this graphic image from a website that you should all, as scholars of history, should be paying attention to. It's called the Wayback Machine. I don't know if any of you have used that, but it enables you to capture screen images from websites, any kind of date over the last several decades now. And so I just went to the Wayback Machine, put in the Johns Hopkins guide and put in June 9th, 2020. The reason I give you these statistics here is that June 9th is 2 days after the New York Times published the Decameron Project. We've been reading a lot of stories from that collection, including Charles Yu's Systems, Mona Awed's A Blue Sky Like This, Mia Koto's An Obliging Robber, and for next week, Tommy Orange's The Team. It's also the exact date of the publication of Together in a Sudden Strangeness. We're reading a poem from that collection in just a second. So it's the end of the first devastating wave of COVID-19 in the United States. 100,000 Americans have died, a number that no one could have predicted in late February, early March of 2020, let alone the immense number of deaths that would result over the next 2 years after Delta and Omicron. It's a time in which COVID was isolated to different pockets of the United States, New York City, Seattle, Detroit, certain farming communities, certain meatpacking communities within certain rural spaces of the United States. So with this in mind, and with some notable exceptions, the first literature that was published around this time period, June 9th and earlier, tends to do something, I think, similar to all the other literature that was produced around this particular time period, which is to draw our attention to the strangeness of the lockdown, of what had just happened, through poetry that might be characterized as kind of trafficking and defamiliarization. So here is one example of what I mean by that, and what I mean by the kind of dominant narrative of looking at what had just happened as a narrative in which we look at ourselves as a species. We recognize ourselves as an immense collective living through a singular experience. This is the poem that I want to begin with. This is Rosanna Warren's poem. She's a University of Chicago professor in the Committee on Social Thought. This is the poem Naturally. I'm going to read it in just a second, but I want to draw your attention before I do to set up the discussion to the epigraph, which is from Thomas Hardy, a great British poet and novelist. This is a kind of enigmatic epigraph. Thomas Hardy writes that I feel that nature is played out as a beauty, but not as a mystery. This is taken from his autobiographical collection called The Life, and the greater context for the epigraph, which we'll talk about in just a second, is Hardy's observation of a particular landscape painting. He says, after looking at the landscape ascribed to Bonington, landscape portrait, a landscape painter in our drawing room. I feel that nature is played out as a beauty, but not as a mystery. I don't want to see landscapes, i.e. scenic paintings of them, because I don't want to see the original reality as optical effects, that is. I want to see the deeper reality underlying the scenic, the expression of what are sometimes called abstract imaginings. And he's taking issue with a painting like this one by Bonington. So by including it there, Warren is setting up a way of reading a set of expectations for her readers that she is going to provide, in some sense, a deeper expression of the reality of this landscape of COVID than a conventional depiction here. So here's what she has to say. Rising in the dark for senior pandemic shopping, we drive east into the spruce silhouetted dawn, watching the sky stain slowly raspberry as the molten copper disk of sun floats up over the highway. A star, a continuous stream of thermonuclear explosions, one of billions in our galaxy, which is one among billions of other galaxies. Our sun lighting our way down the exit ramp into the Walmart parking lot at 6:30 a.m. on planet Earth. We fiddle our masks on over our mammalian noses. We glove our hairless simian fingers and palms. Avoiding our masked and fumbling hominid cousins, we forage along half-empty shelves for relics of what our sun has fired into vegetal cells, and find 3 elderly cabbages lacking their outer leaves, browned in patches but solid, their minerals folded into dense globed dictionaries we will consult and absorb studiously in our retreat for the next few weeks. This is, needless to say, a very strange description of a visit to the local Walmart. And I want to get your thoughts on the depiction through a series of questions that I would love for you to chime in on either orally or typing your responses. But the first one, the kind of question that the epigraph raises is, what is the relationship between that epigraph, where Thomas Hardy wants to see once again the mystery, the deeper reality underlying the scene. What's the relationship between that epigraph and Warren's poem here? How is she showing us nature as a mystery, or unveiling what was hidden from nature? What is she trying to do? My second question is, how does nature defamiliarize ourselves here then? So if the cabbage is turning into something that is fired by, is a relic of our sun fired into vegetal cells, if the sun itself is transformed into a continuous stream of thermonuclear explosions, what does this defamiliarization do to us? What are some strange features of Warren's characterization of herself traveling with her partner to a Walmart, a seemingly everyday kind of experience? But what does the pandemic do to that experience? How does she see herself in a different way? But the big thing that I want to kind of draw your attention to, I think this is a really super common trope that you see. We saw this, for those of you who attended my earlier session on Charles Yu's systems. It's a very similar kind of conceit there of, like, I'm looking at myself as a member of this enormous population. Is who belongs in that community and who is missing from it? If we're all turned into fumbling creatures who put on our masks and socially distance, who might belong to that community other than the seniors in this case, and who might be missing from it? This is from the COVID Chronicles, and it's just as a kind of side note, for those of you who are interested in teaching this early literature of COVID-19, you really have to be careful about tracking when, as we talked about last time, actually with Philip Springer, tracking when these stories were published initially, because the COVID Chronicles is an anthology from 2021. This graphic narrative by Emily Steinberg, Ring the Bells, is actually from much earlier than that. It's from March 30th, 2020. So right pretty much at the very beginning of the lockdown, but we get a similar kind of sense of collectivity that Steinberg's kind of narrator, if you want to characterize it as such, wants to cast as the entirety of human populations. So she writes, now worldwide, people are dying alone in quarantine. Morgues are overflowing and loved ones cannot attend funerals. We panic and stockpile 3-month supplies of canned food, disinfectant, and toilet paper. We self-isolate and practice social distancing. Hey, hi, woof. We do Zoom meetings. Holy shit, business, the stock market tanks in a 1930s swoon. Businesses close, unemployment soars, and the frenetic hamster wheel of modern life stops short, and we collectively grind to a halt. Here's just 3 more panels from this graphic narrative. And yet, in the midst of the grimness, isn't there an opportunity here? 2-mile morning walk with Barbara, my 78-year-old neighbor. Can we learn to slow down? Can we forge a new way of living? Can we learn from this calamity to limit the way we damage the earth? Instead of traffic now, we can hear birds. Can we hold on to that? Venice is empty of tourists. The canals are clean. The dolphins have returned. Well, that turned out to be a hoax, but we also wanted it to be true. And this is actually kind of similar if you were able to attend my my previous lecture on COVID animals. This is a similar kind of narrative of pause to the one that I introduced there. And finally, can we rebuild, rewire our brains, throttle back, trot more lightly, consume more thoughtfully? Can we be smarter? So the 2 questions, and again, this is not to be overly critical of either of these 2 works, which I think are beautiful, interesting, and important in their own ways, but they can't be, if you're going to teach a course on COVID, they can't be the dominant story because they tend to be written by and seem to be directed towards certain kinds of audiences that are different from other kinds of audiences who might be more vulnerable during the first months of the COVID-19 lockdown. So who is the we in this narrative? Is everyone on the planet doing Zoom meetings? Is everyone on the planet or within the United States stocking up on 3-month supplies of canned food? Like, I would say that, for example, by suggesting we do Zoom meetings, it suggests that we there are people who have laptops, people who have certain kinds of jobs that work in certain kinds of information industries, right? The people who can stockpile 3 months supplies of canned food are the people who can afford to stock up on 3-month supplies of canned food. The people who are interested in learning to slow down, in forging a new way of living, are the people who can afford to socially distance, right? You're actually getting, strangely enough, in a kind of ironic sense, away from the world based upon this kind of collective we. And now I want to tell you a different story. That is, during this time, we know, because of a lot of really important work that the Mayo Clinic has done, that within the United States, if you're an American Indian or if you're an Alaska Native people, you're 3 times more likely to be hospitalized than white Americans. And if you're Black or African American, you're twice as likely to be hospitalized than white Americans during this pandemic. And as we read from the CDC, this tracks with a whole lot of other kinds of data processing. If you're Black or African American, if you're Hispanic or Latino, if you're American Indian, if you're an Alaska Native, you are going to, your community has experienced much higher rates of COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths compared to non-Hispanic white populations of the United States. And these disparities, as the CDC goes on to say, you can't just dismiss them as this is demographics, this is socioeconomics. These disparities persist even when accounting for those particular factors. That the story of a Black man or woman, a Hispanic man or woman, an American Indian, an Alaskan Native, is a little bit different than the collective story of America and the collective story of the world. In fact, I think this tracks also with Miyakoto's characterization of the global South, is that we're actually living through a variety of different kinds of pandemics, even right from the start, based upon our particular class position and our particular race position. And that's intensified in terms of the early racial history of COVID. And I want to pivot to that right now and then move to get your thoughts on, I think, one of the most important early readings of how race kind of intervenes in the early history and early literature of COVID-19. That's Zadie Smith's Postscript. There is a dominant narrative associated with the early COVID-19 history. And if we continue to teach it as a series of people, a collective mass within the United States and within the world stops doing everything that they would normally do, locks down, switches over to Zoom, it effaces, not intentionally, but it could, if that was the only narrative that was being presented, it could obscure the ways in which essential workers, for example, enabled the lockdowns, enabled people to survive, right? Saved a whole lot of lives, but were exposed to a whole lot of risk. And within the United States, that risk fell along racialized lines. We need to pair those kinds of stories with other kinds of stories about these populations that aren't really thrown into relief in a lot of the narratives that we tend to associate with COVID-19. This is what's happening right around the time, or shortly before the publications of the first 2 works, and you get a different kind of history. Again, you don't have to choose one or the other in a zero-sum situation, but I think you have to choose both. That in the United States, for a variety of reasons, incidents of anti-Asian American xenophobia and racism kind of spiked early on for a variety of reasons. Most notably, and this is something that we talked about a couple class periods ago with Sally Mao's poem Batshit. On April 7th, 2020, an Asian American woman is attacked with acid. She has acid thrown on her face in Brooklyn, New York. And then roughly 2 weeks, just a little over 2 weeks before the publication of these two important first works, first responses to COVID. So not really, other than Charles Yu, there wasn't really time. I don't know how Charles Yu was able to integrate this. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd, a Black man in Minneapolis, is murdered by police, creating this immense political response, a really heartwarming response on the part of a variety of different communities resisting certain kinds of white supremacy. At the same time, between these two periods, between April 2020 and May 2020, COVID rates in rural counties really stay low, except in certain counties with meatpacking facilities, which forced, as I talked about in my talk about animals, which forced people into really enclosed areas. Those rural counties were 10 times higher in terms of COVID rates than those without such facilities. And those facilities are stocked with Hispanic, Latino, Latinx peoples and Black peoples. So during this same time, as the CDC reports, racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately, quote, represented in essential work settings, such as healthcare facilities, farms, factories, warehouses, food processing, accommodation and food service, retail service, grocery stores, and public transportation. Basically, like within the United States, racial and ethnic minorities kept, in many respects, the country going while a whole lot of other people were locked down. So enter Zadie Smith, the great English novelist, and she'd kind of signed a contract to write a series of essays about the early days of COVID-19. It was ultimately published in July 28th, 2020. And there's a variety of different essays. They're all kind of beautiful, and they range in a variety of different subjects. But her final essay, which was written in the wake of the George Floyd murder, is Postscript. That's the subject that I want to move to right now, because it's one of, again, the few narratives that I think you could introduce to students that complicates this kind of singular narrative of a world under lockdown. I think it does it in a way that makes it incredibly important, in the same way that Charles Yu's Systems is important and Miyakoto's An Obliging Robber is important. We don't have time to go through a whole lot of the essay, so I just want to focus on one thing, one entry point, because it's difficult to talk about race in classrooms. And one way that I've found that you can kind of ease students into it is to present formal questions for your students to kind of work through. So one formal question, and it's this essay kind of lends itself to this formal question, is how does the metaphor work here? The title of this piece by Zadie Smith is Postscript, Virus as Contempt. And I want to spend a bit of time talking about how that metaphor works, what its ground is. A metaphor is a comparison between two different things. So the comparison right here is between contempt or structural racism and a virus, presumably the virus SARS-CoV-2. So I'm going to begin by saying, like, what's similar about it, and then we'll talk about what's different, and then I want to get your thoughts in terms of what you liked and what you didn't like about this Zadie Smith essay. So here's a couple things that make structural racism, I say white supremacy, or contempt, as she characterizes it, is like a virus. Well, one of the ways in which she characterizes it as such is that, like a virus, it spreads rapidly. It infects individuals first, but spreads rapidly through families, communities, peoples, power structures, and nations. This is kind of a similar kind of language to how Priscilla Wald describes the outbreak narratives, as it kind of radiates through society and creates certain kinds of communities and illuminates certain kinds of communities. As Priscilla Wald characterized it, as we talked about on the second day of this class, the same things that threaten us with contagion model the same circulation of ideas, and here that's kind of literalized here. Like Wald's work, the outbreak narrative is a search for the origin, or as Zadie Smith characterizes it, using the language, controversial language of the 1980s HIV epidemic, the patient zero virus. This virus of contempt has a patient zero who stood, quote, on a slave ship 400 years ago, looked down at the sweating, bleeding, moaning mass below deck, reverse engineered an emotion. This is the first Zadie Smith to completely dehumanize Black populations, Black peoples, in the service of the American slave trade. And then also, like Wald, I think you could, if you're interested in writing an essay on Zadie Smith's work, I think Priscilla Wald would be a very good choice to kind of pair your essay with her theoretical framework. The virus has healthy carriers, as we talked about in the second class. Quote, they work like a virus. They work invisibly within your body until you grow sick with them. I truly believe that many people are unaware that they carry the virus at all, until the very moment when you find yourself phoning the cops to explain the race of the man you thought looked suspicious, walking through his own neighborhood. An allusion to countless stories, many of which you've no doubt encountered, thinking of like Trayvon Martin, for example, a young boy who was killed walking through his neighborhood because he looked suspicious. So there's a lot of different ways in which Zadie Smith, like Charles Yu in Systems, is trying to unite this circulating global viral phenomenon with the transmission of certain kinds of ideas. In this case, ideas that we associate, we can call them various things: structural racism, white supremacy, and so on. At the same time, there's a ton of tension here in this story, in this essay rather, and the tension confused the heck out of my students when I taught this essay for the first time to Oregon State students last fall, because the virus doesn't kill the person who is infected by it. It doesn't kill the host. It kills other people, right? Within the terms, the metaphorical terms. When contempt kills you, it doesn't have to be a vendetta or indeed even entirely conscious. It can be just a passing whim. And at the same time, given the fact that Smith is talking about viruses, she also talks about the virus or different kinds of diseases that are attached to certain peoples, at least in our cultural imagination. She talks about the contagion of poverty and the plague class, which is not the class of people who have this virus of contempt, but have a different kind of virus. So there's this kind of cascading set of viral or illness metaphors that resemble in some ways what we talked about in the first class on Susan Sontag. So the discussion questions I have are really a bit more open-ended than the discussion questions that I had for the Warren work and for Ring the Bells. And that the first one I want to get to is like, what are the advantages and some potential disadvantages of viewing contempt through this healthy carrier model of Smith? So instead of concentrating on initially the tensions or the differences between a virus and structural racism, I just want to concentrate on the similarities for now. What are some of the advantages that you think of? And again, I don't have a specific answer in mind. I'm not. I would love to get your thoughts on this. What are the advantages of seeing contempt through the healthy carrier model of Smith, of like having a disease, being able to threaten other people with the disease, but being unaware that you have that disease? To ask to kind of push a little bit further, what is the advantage of seeing it as a biological transmission, which, like Warren's work, presents certain things as kind of fully natural, and kind of obscures in some ways the fact that we're not talking about a biological agent here that takes over someone, but something that is kind of more an element of the social than the natural. Or, I could ask the question that I wanted to kind of conclude with, which is what might be some disadvantages to viewing COVID as a virus affecting white people, given the racial history of COVID. It is strange to use the metaphor in this particular way. And that, again, this is not something that Smith would have really had access to at the time. It seems like her work was more concerned with George Floyd in that particular essay, and couldn't be expected to anticipate the clarity by which the Mayo Clinic and the CDC kind of characterized the pandemic itself as a pandemic that disproportionately affected people of color. So I think one disadvantage is it kind of naturalizes racism. If racism operates like a natural biological entity, then do individuals have any kind of control over the racism that they kind of, or are they just simply echoing the racism of the broader culture? The big conclusions that I wanted to get across today is that many early COVID narratives tend to frame the lockdown within the United States and arguably beyond the United States as a collective pause that enables us to rethink our behaviors and consumer patterns and communities. And I think that that is a sentiment that is beautiful and interesting and useful, and certainly crucial to our understanding, both current and down the road when we teach this particular moment in US and world history in 10 years and 20 years. I think this is a good perspective to have. But in the early literature of COVID-19, I think this continues on into the present, how this is going to change. A central absence from the bulk of that literature is any discussion of the many peoples within the United States marginalized by class position and race and ethnic positions, who were excluded from these kind of quasi-utopian, if you want to characterize it as such, visions of COVID present and future. And I think that this is really a incentive for those of us who are interested in teaching a literature that reflects the diverse experiences of the pandemic. We need to really key in on certain stories, certain essays, and I think even if they're messy, like Zadie Smith's Postscript, like Charles Yu's Systems, like Miyakuto's An Obliging Robber, like Sally Mao's Batshit, that address this coeval history in the United States of race, a history that is important, that is rough to talk about, but is a crucial component of that larger COVID history. But more work is needed to properly tell the stories of people whose experiences differed immensely from those more privileged, I might say, stories of early COVID storytellers.